Like
How about singing?
Yeah, like a stage manager at a concert. Oh, the band's coming. Let's have auditions. I don't know. But so this is Brandon's random writing workshop. Less workshop, more Brandon blabs at you. How many of you were here last year? And this, okay. I'm gonna do different things this year intentionally. I just want to know. Last year we talked about characterization and we talked about description, I believe, were our two main things. Steve and I can't remember what I talked about the year before. I guess the statute of limitations is 1 year or 2 years, so I'm me remembering. Does anyone remember? Anyone here 2 years ago?
It
was world building. Yeah, I did 2 of them though. I think.
Yeah, I think so much more.
Yeah, the other one was so distinctive.
It's a point of view too.
Did I just a point of view? I'm going to talk about a few things today. The first one is I want to do the inaugural lecture. I actually haven't done this one before. On Sanderson's second law. Very humbly titled. I'm very humble with my titling of these. Does anyone know Sanderson's first law?
Don't interrupt your magic game?
No, that's a good law though.
It is about magic though.
So can you quote it?
It was, oh no, it was something about,
It's like
if you're going to use magic, you have to, if you're going to do anything, then you have to properly foreshadow it?
Yeah, you basically have it. Sanderson's first law is that your ability to satisfactorily resolve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well your reader understands said magic. Basically, Sanderson's first law, and these have to do with magic system creation. And with, they're greater writing principles than just about magic. I'll go over Sanderson's first law just a little bit for you so you can kind of grasp what's going on here. The idea is that if you're going to have characters who have access to magic in your books, and if you're going to want to use that magic to solve problems for your characters, you should lay the groundwork by letting the reader understand what the magic is capable of. So when you solve the problems with your magic, it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel like you're cheating. This is a greater principle than just magic systems, so I like to frame these things in magic system discussions because it's one of the things I'm known for. But if you actually really think about it, this is a writing principle. The writing principle is anytime you want to use any element in your story to resolve conflict, you are much better off if your reader understands that it's possible. All right? We're talking about satisfying conflict resolution with these. You can do it unsatisfyingly. And in fact, we commonly do this as writers in the first third of the book. Because we're trying to achieve something else. For instance, if we have an unknown friend of the protagonist, let's say she's in dire straits, and she's been trapped at the edge of a cliff by a bunch of mutant zombie werebores or something, and then her friend shows up at the last minute and rescues her. You'll see this sort of thing happening in the first third of books or films all the time. It's not really very satisfying, but the point of that is to introduce a cool new character that is then going to become part of the story from then on. You'll see us do this in the first third because the point of that sequence is not to have a satisfying resolution, but to introduce a new cool character. If that's the exact same scene as the climax at the end of the book, and a new character who is unheard of shows up and saves the protagonist, you've got a very unsatisfying conflict resolution at the end of your story. All right? I often share the concept when we're talking about this of the 2 Lord of the Rings movies. This might be a little bit of overlap for you. For those who haven't, just a brief outline of this. If you watch those 2 Lord of the Rings movies, and the conflicts are presented slightly differently. I think one of the weakest things about the trilogy, though I absolutely love the trilogy, did some fantastic things. One of the weakest things was some of the conflict resolution at the end of the 3rd movie. Which actually is somewhat odd because The conflict resolution at the end of the second movie was very similar, and yet worked fantastically well. And it's about reader expectations and foreshadowing. Second movie, we have Helm's Deep, right? And the heroes are in Helm's Deep trying to fight off an impossible number of orcs that are going to destroy them. Well, in the third movie, we basically have a similar setup in one of the plot sequences. It's not the only thing, but it's Minas Tirith, right? They're in Minas Tirith. Am I pronouncing that right, Tolkien fanatics? I'm probably not.
It's Minas Tirith.
Minos Tirith. Okay. Minos Tirith. Okay. Tolkien, if there was anyone who was more precise about his pronunciations than Robert Jordan was, it's Tolkien. Minas Tirith, they're, again, surrounded by overwhelming numbers of enemies, and there seems to be no hope for survival. It's basically the same plot structure for those two things, and yet they're wildly different. Because in the first movie, what is the setup? Do you guys know? Gandalf went to get help, and he told them, hold out until the morning of the third day, right? Until dawn, until you see the sun of the third day. And so the plot setup, this is all about foreshadowing, is, guys, just survive long enough for me to come save you. Well, the third movie is presented in such a way that we need to win here or we fail. There is no sense of, there's just a tiny little bit of one, I mean, they try to, but it's really not for me a sense of, wait until Aragorn comes and saves you. No, it's, we as heroes need to be victorious here and fight this massive battle, hi Bob. And we need to win or else. And then Aragorn shows up and saves them. And so it feels like something of a failure if you actually, in the moment, because like we weren't good enough to hold out, and we had to have what we call a Deus Ex Machina come save us. Where in the second movie, the exact same thing happens, and yet it is one of the most victorious, awesome moments in the entire series when they, trusting in their friend, ride out and look at the dawn, and you as viewers have forgotten Gandalf because of some really good smoke and mirrors, and you see him, and he comes with the army that's been foreshadowed is out there, and you have this wonderful moment, when the light comes down and Gandalf rides up. It's beautiful. It's a fantastic moment. And it's very different from the same moment where, I don't know how many of you, if any of you felt anything like that when Aragorn shows up with the ghost, but I didn't. I'm like, oh great, now the ghosts are going to go kill everything. And that the heroes would have just not, if they would have just held back or run, then Aragorn would have saved them anyway. So all of their struggle was basically worthless because Aragorn came and fought the fight. So that's Sanderson's first law. When you're doing this with magic systems, the idea is if you want to be solving your problems with magic, which you don't have to do. There are plenty of great books that want the magic to be wondrous and mysterious. And when the characters use it, they don't really know what's going to happen, and it's often worse for them, or when they use the magic. If you want to have satisfying resolution, you first set up what the magic can do. And again, it's very different beginning of book or end of book. If you look at Jim's use of Balefire, this is an example. The first time Balefire is used, it just kind of comes out of nowhere, and it's like, okay, we're saved. But that's okay because it's introducing this new character, so to speak, that's written in to save them, because then, later on, he does very great, wonderful things with Balefire regarding saving friends, and it gives Rand and company a tool to use rather than having them just Deus Ex Machina. If the first time Balefire had been revealed would have been the end of Fires of Heaven, it would have felt different than it does now because we knew what Balefire could do, and so therefore using it to save someone's life becomes an interesting conflict resolution rather than Deus Ex Machina. All right? So that's Sanderson's first law. Peter, I need some water. I've got a big water bottle up my room, or are you going to stay at the cup?
I can need a glass or you can get water.
Go ahead and give me a glass. You may have to refill it frequently.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Sanderson's second law of magic systems. Sanderson's second law is very simple. It goes like this. limitations are more important than powers. All right? The idea being, when you are building a magic system, and I'll talk about this as a greater magic system thing, or greater writing principle as well, but we'll just narrow it down to magic systems in the beginning. I talk to a lot of new writers who, having read great fantasy books with wonderful magic systems, are spending a lot of time coming up with cool powers to happen in their books. The problem is that, number one, it's very, very hard to come up with something that hasn't been done before, particularly if you're not bounding it by limitations. And so 90% of those magic systems people come to me with are magic systems I've seen a dozen times. And they're magic systems that you have seen a dozen times. They feel fresh and new to the person creating them, but they really aren't that fresh and new. They tend to fall into one of several categories. The Aristotelian elements, fire, air, earth, water, or they fall into what you might call the Jedi powers, which telekinesis or mind manipulation, the basic psychic powers. You see a lot of people that their powers are somewhat like superhero powers. They can fly or this or that. And there's nothing wrong with any of these. But they feel very cliched to us. The problem I found with the cliche is not over here. Like I said, it's very hard to do something that hasn't been done before, particularly with, 80 years of superhero comic books or whatever. These people, if you go look, they have plumbed the depths of superhero or of powers that people can have. They have the most weird powers for superheroes. They really, there were eras where they were creating like 3 or 4 new ones for each comic book, and like, okay, what are we going to do in this one? That's the person who can take their limbs off and throw them at people. Okay, let's do it. That's a real superhero.
With compliments from Lou Theron.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much. So, how do you then actually create a unique and interesting magic system? Well, I think it comes down to this. Magic systems are more interesting in what they can't do than in what they can do. And I'm gonna delve into this and try and show it to you. When we're talking about limitations, I actually have under this category in my head, there are actually 3 different things that I'm speaking of as limitations. I use the word limitations, but there are actually true limitations, there are weaknesses, and there are, I have it in my head. This is a really weird whiteboard. You guys see what this thing is doing? Mm-hmm. That's very strange. There are costs. What's that?
Is it a whiteboard? Are those markers for a whiteboard?
I don't know.
That's why the paper was. It looks like it's coming off.
Yeah. I don't know.
Does it say dry erase?
It doesn't say dry erase. So, I do have dry erase markers in my backpack here. Maybe we should just put this thing up, though. I don't know. I mean, why do they give you markers in a whiteboard if they're not going to have whiteboard markers?
Because you also have the paper.
Yeah, I know. I do also have the paper, but really, who uses paper? Who wants to waste paper when we have a whiteboard? And why make it so it comes right off? Yeah. Well, does anyone have a Kleenex or something? We'll just see if it wipes off. You do? Okay. Is this used? It's not wiping that well.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's going to take
Magic eraser.
magic eraser to get it off. All right, we'll use their stupid paper. Are there, well, we'll just use the paper. It's easy. Thank you for this stuff. Okay, so let's write this up here again. Someone's going to ask me to sign this and then they're going to put it on eBay.
Volunteers?
Okay, limitations, costs, and weaknesses. In my mind, I'm kind of splitting them up into these three categories. This is actually different. I mean, this is just semantics. This is how I define it. You can define it however you want to in your own head, but I think it's an important thing to start thinking about. So these are really what are going to make your magic system unique. It's not going to be the powers. It's going to be the limitations on those powers that make it interesting. I like this con because I can always use the Wheel of Time as an example, because the majority of my audience is going to be familiar with it. So let's talk about the Wheel of Time magic system, all right? Let's talk about its costs, limitations, and weaknesses. And show you how this magic system is really defined more by its costs, its weaknesses, and limitations. Actually, you know what? I'm going to step back and take an easier one first. We'll do Wheel of Time next because it's actually much more complicated. Let's take something easier and simpler. When discussing magic systems, I actually like to talk about superheroes a lot. There's a couple reasons to this. Number one, a lot of people are familiar with them. They've become kind of ubiquitous in our culture, part of pop culture. So we know what most of us know what the main superheroes can do. Number two reason is superheroes tend to, in the modern era, not in the golden age, but the modern era, have their powers pretty well defined for us. So we all know basically what a superhero can do. Let's take the iconic pinnacle of superheroes and talk about Superman, okay? Superman. What are Superman's powers?
X-ray vision.
All right, fly, laser eyes, X-ray vision, super strength, super speed, and basically indestructible, right? Yeah. If you think about that, you've got this big list of powers, right? He's got some awesome powers. In fact, in the power grab bag, he came out with basically the coolest set that you could want for, right? Lasers from his eyes, fly, faster than almost the speed of light. Not really, but he could fly really fast, and he's basically indestructible. Are these what makes Superman interesting? When people talk about Superman, does that define who he is or what his stories are about? No, it isn't. He can have a completely different set of powers, and it really actually wouldn't change him that much. Now, what do we talk about when we talk about Superman?
Kryptonite.
Kryptonite. Kryptonite is a very big one. You got any others that when you talk about Superman?
Lois Lane. If she's
Lois
in trouble,
Lane.
He's
Yeah.
compelled to save her.
Yep. You've got actually two things there: Lois and his moral code.
Right.
Red sunlight too.
What's that? Yeah, we're not going to go into some of those weirder ones, but I actually list when I did these as the basic three. Superman stories. When you read a good Superman story or you see one, it is almost always having to do with one of these three things. And in this case, it's more like Lois isn't the problem. It's Superman's love of Lois. His limitations and his weaknesses define who Superman is to us. When you're going to have a story about Superman, it's going to involve his powers being taken away. That's what's interesting. Not having them in the first place, losing them is interesting. Now, of course, he has to have them in the first place before he can lose them. So the powers are important, but this is way more important. Or it's going to deal with who he is and his moral code, which is a limitation on Superman's power because he will refuse to do certain things with his power because of the moral individual he is. And stories come out of that right and left. So how Superman is limited is what's interesting about it, which is fascinating to me as a person who writes magic systems. And you'll see that the best magic systems out there become fascinating because of these things. not because of what they're capable of doing in the first place. Wheel of Time is another fantastic example. What can weaves do in the Wheel of Time books? Yeah, we really only have had like 2 things proven that we can't really do. We can't fly, they used to be able to, and we can't bring people back from the dead. And there are, those are the limitations. Basically, the power's really capable of doing anything, but the stories are not about what the powers are capable of doing.
I would say one of the big limitations of the power is just because you have to know the weaves.
Right.
If you haven't been exposed to the weaves or haven't stumbled upon it, then you can't do these things.
Right. So big limitation right off, very important for the Wheel of Time is skill. Skill for the magic system is a major factor in this magic system. And in fact, that limiting factor, that it takes a lot of skill, a lot of work to learn how to do it, is basically a source of conflict for a number of the characters throughout, like the first 8 or 9 books.
And energy is tiring.
What's that? Energy is tiring, it's fatiguing.
Fatigue.
I don't know how to write fatiguing. Peter? Oh, that's spelled right. Just pretend. Go ahead. Yeah.
The high sky put limits on themselves with the 3 O's.
Yes, 3 O's.
Use the power to kill another person.
It's addicting.
What's that? Okay, it's addictive. Yeah, let's see, is that? That's more of a cost.
Fatiguing and addicting would be cost.
Yeah, fatiguing would go under a cost as well. Basically, the way I'm looking at this, costs are what you have to pay in order to use it. It really gets fuzzy because you say, well, skill, that's a cost too. It's time you have to pay. These things get really kind of fuzzy, which is why I lump them under one group. But I do like to try and think of them as separate things. One of the big costs is madness. Right, for men. This is probably the single most fascinating thing for me about the entire Wheel of Time. When I read the first book in 1990, I said, wow, this is different. Because, I've been reading a lot of authors that I like, that are decent authors at the time. But, this skill and fatigue actually show up pretty frequently in magic systems. And that's really not anything that unique. It's done well in the Wheel of Time, but it's not that unique. This, I have never seen anything like this. And the idea that our primary protagonist, would, by an effect of the magic, slowly go mad, was just awesome. Because this is a fantastic cost. This is one of the best costs around there. And there's a couple of reasons for this. All right. Number one, it has a real story-changing feel to it. Okay. And when you're designing limitations and costs, comparing these right here, you can get into how story-changing they are. These are all fairly story-changing, but you'll find people that will build costs that aren't really costs into the magic system in order to have a cost. A great example of this is Dungeons & Dragons. And you guys play D&D? In D&D, there's a magic system cost that in order to cast spells, you have to have like these special implements. What do they call them? Your material components. Like if you're going to cast a fireball, you need to have like a pinch of sulfur. That actually conceptually is pretty awesome. If you think about it. Sympathetic magic. Rothfuss in The Name of the Wind did fantastic, fascinating things with sympathetic magic, which is the same magic system. In D&D, it's meaningless. Because they basically just say, yeah, but the wizard will always have as many of them as they need, unless the GM takes them away. So it's basically just a way that gives the GM a tool, the Game Master a tool, to remove the magic from the characters if for some reason they need to not be able to escape from this trap. He can say, oh, but you're out of sulfur, or whatever. And, let's see, when did I start playing D&D? 20 years of off and on playing D&D? That's happened like twice. And it was both times the reason of, you guys have been captured by whatever, and they took away all your stuff. Now how are you going to get out? That sort of situation. You will find magic systems in books, and writers will come up with, that they think are going to be this cool limitation, but it has no real effect on the story. And that's a storytelling issue, not a magic system issue. When you've got weaknesses and limitations, they should have an impact on the story. For instance, if going mad took 20 years, or even 10 years, it would be meaningless story-wise for the Wheel of Time. It may create character angst, but across the course of a book series that's taking 2 years, in world time, going mad in 10 is basically meaningless. What this one did is, no, you're going to start going mad immediately. And by the middle books, you're going to start seeing the effects, and it's going to creep you out. And the character's personality will start to change. The character's personality change gives them an arc with real motion and movement in it that is just fascinating and painful and awesome to watch all at the same time. To watch Rand's descent into madness and keeping control of himself. This was a really interesting thing. Even in the early books, when he wasn't going mad yet, he, every other chapter is thinking, is this me going mad? Or is this, how can I tell if I'm going mad or not? Fascinating because of its effect on the story. Number two, it was interesting because it's not anything I had read before. Because there are no new ideas in the sun. Someone had probably done it before, but not in the major fantasy series, because I can tell you I've read them all. And this was brand new. That freshness and innovativeness is not nearly as hard to do with limitations as it is to do with powers. But that's okay, because the powers aren't going to be as interesting as the limitations anyway. So you can come up with the most cliched, generic power that you can, and if you come up with a fascinating cost or limitation or weakness that is really steeped in what's going on in the story, then you are going to have an awesome magic system. No matter how cliched it seems at the first get-go. And understanding this has been kind of a revelation to me. When I first wrote Mistborn, the original Mistborn, not the one that got published, the one that the magic system worked fantastically well and the characters were terrible. And I rewrote it a couple of years later after I was published and was starting to understand things. What about that magic system, I kept thinking, why is this one working so well? Because it really did work really well. It was something that readers really connected with them, and something about the magic system was just working. Well, part of it is this little hybrid science magic thing that I like to do, which we're not going to go into it this one. But that's one of the things that I like to do. But part of what was working was a lot of the powers are basically, like I said, there's not any way to do really, really original powers. Maybe there is, but it's really hard. The powers in Mistborn are pretty basic. We have telekinesis. It's the basic power, the power to make yourself tougher. And those are the two powers that are really coming into play very often. You do have some manipulation of emotions and some of these things, but the one people really like is the pushing and pulling. Well, pushing and pulling is basically telekinesis. You move things with your mind. In those 4 books, if you haven't read them, what you can do is, if you're an Alamancer, particularly if you're a Mistborn, you can ingest a bit of metal. Yeah, I know, weird. And then you actually burn that metal inside of you, which is also very weird, and I can get into why that actually works later. But the whole thing is you can then push, using your center of mass, on metal objects and shove them away from you, or you can pull them towards you. It's basically just a really, really limited form of telekinesis. And so, but the fun thing in the magic systems does not come from the fact that we're doing telekinesis. It comes from the fact that if you push on something heavy in yourself, you are pushed backward. We play with conservation of energy just a little bit and of momentum, and we use vector physics. And so you can only push directly away from you or pull directly towards you. So if you want that object over there, you got to pull it right toward here. And if you pull too hard, you're just going to stab yourself with it. You got that knife, and so you got to be careful. And if you end up pushing on something and it runs into something very heavy, and you're still pushing on it, then backwards you go. And this very limited magic system was much more interesting than just being able to wave your hand and move anything you want. In fact, one of the things that's bugged me about the Force is that the telekinesis seems to have no real solid boundaries or rules on it. They're doing different stuff in different movies, and it doesn't really seem to make any sense, and there don't seem to be many limitations on it. I mean, you have in like the third movie, you force push against each other and get thrown back, which is cool, but you never see anything like that in any of the other movies. You know, in one movie, you've got Luke like going so hard to get his lightsaber, and then in other movies, you've got Darth Maul going point, and then something flies where he wants it. Point, something flies where he wants it. It becomes somewhat unfulfilling as a magic system for me because of the lack of boundaries on it. And so, yeah, those limitations are what make it really interesting. Let's talk about some different versions of these that you could, you know, I assume if you're in here, you're interested in writing yourself, or you're at least interested in the process. Let's just talk about the things that I see as limitations, costs, and weaknesses. Limitations, at the top, these are all can be pretty vague. Limitations, the most vague one, simply because, do you call it a limitation that that Alamancy can't transmute pigs into groundhogs? Because it can't. That's a limitation of magic, but it's not really part of the discourse. There are going to be lots of things your magic can't do. So the limitations we're talking about are limits on the natural power that the magic has. Where you design the magic and you say, okay, I'm gonna do a magic system where, you know, people throw fire from their hands. Okay, then you put limitations on it. They can throw fire from their hands, but they have to have fire first to manipulate. So they can't create fire. They can only, you know, push it around. And then you've got basically a superhero magic system. They use this one fairly frequently, and it makes it interesting. It really does. They did in the second X-Men film, and not being able to make the fire is a great limitation for that type of magic. You can do something like that pretty easily. The idea is that you design your magic system and then design what it can't do, despite having the powers that, you know, knee-jerk, you might say you could do. The Wheel of Time not being able to fly is one of these. Not being able to bring someone back from the dead is one of these. The really, really good ones, though, the goal of them is to force conflict and struggle upon your characters. Okay? For those who were here, you'll remember. If you'll remember, stories are about, for me, plot, setting, and character. And the story comes from this point of conflict. Stories where plot setting and character are at least two of the three butt heads. Where you find the conflict is where you find the story. Even if, you know, you find the conflict only between character and you know, the character conflicts alone, this can be story, this can be story, this can be story, this can be a better story. And right here, the sweet spot, in my opinion, are the best stories. The focus of plot setting and character conflict. And your magic systems should hopefully be helping you with this. You were looking for these points of conflict. Right here is Rand going mad. The sweet spot, right? Because it's setting the magic. Is setting its character because of the psychological effects. And its plot because he needs to save the world with the magic. So he's forced to use a magic that's going to drive him mad. Suddenly you have plot, setting, and character all coming together. Another sweet spot in here is the magic from Dune. Dune has a wonderful sweet spot where the spice is the means by which interplanetary control is maintained. You can't go with FTL without the spice. You can't move from planet to planet. The Empire would not exist without this, cannot exist without this stuff. It is plot because, it's setting also because it's tied directly to the world. It's plot because Paul's family has been put in charge of this world and need to fend off attacks from other people. And it's character because we really get to know Paul and he gets thrust right into the middle of this and gets caught between the two worlds. He's right there in the center. And all three of these things are intersecting in Dune, which is part of what makes Dune work so well, in my opinion, is you've got the great intersection of these three things. And so when you're designing your limitations, the idea for your limitation is that you want to try and create these points of conflict with that limitation. Giving a limitation and not having big points of conflict is a wasted opportunity. That said, you can overdo this. Wheel of Time really only needed the one big one for the magic system because it was so powerful to the main character. You'll see littler ones, though, for instance, with Perrin's Wolves. And Perrin's Wolves is really kind of more one of these along here. It's not as integral to the plot. It's integral to Perrin and who he is. But if he doesn't master the wolves, it's not going to be the end of the world, at least not as we've been presented it. It could end up being very troubling, but it's still a great conflict because it's mixing two of these and finding the conflict in between them. And you see a lot of these in the Wheel of Time as well. And so limit your magic in ways that will force you as a writer to have to struggle to deal with that limitation. Okay? Don't just put a limitation on that is not going to create these points of conflict. And it's actually a little bit harder than you think. I mean, ramming everything together like Rand's madness, having that idea, you go mad for using magic, that's a great idea, but until Robert Jordan worked it into an actual character's emotions, to the point that until he worked it into the plot of the story, it being integral, you really didn't have anything. It was still a cool idea, but it's the actualization that made it awesome. So, limitations. Limits on your magic. Understand that skill and fatigue are two of the biggest used ones. Particularly nowadays in the post-Wheel of Time world. This is pretty natural. So those, you're probably just going to take these for granted. You need to come up with some more. The 3 O's are a great one. Come up with different limitations in addition to these. It doesn't mean you can't use these, because these are great things. They're gonna shape, force and shape your character. You're just not innovative any longer. All right? Let's go to costs. Costs are another way to be really interesting. And the limitation, Rand's is really a cost, as we've talked about, not a limitation. But you can have very fascinating costs. They're easy to add into magic systems, and if you come up with a good one, this is probably the place to be looking first. Because what the magic costs in order to use can be really fascinating. For instance, Dune, the spice is a cost, not a limitation. There are limitations to the spice. Once you use it, it runs out. But it's really a cost, and the effects it has on you are also costs. You must pay the price to use this stuff. I almost made a rhyme, but I decided not to. You have to pay the price, and it has an effect on you over time. These are interesting costs. One thing to be aware of with costs is that it is possible to go overboard on them. All right? For instance, if you have a magic system that in order to use the magic, it kills one of your parents every time you cast a spell. How frequently can you as writers use that magic in your books? Twice at the most. Unless you figure out some wacky adoption system that somehow the magic accepts. But you see what I'm saying here? If that's actually a really traumatic cost. But that becomes a cost for a short story and not a novel, because you can tell a short story about someone trying to make this decision and what cost is worth, this terrible price. But in a novel form, stretching that across an entire book or several books without the magic actually ever doing anything is going to be really annoying. And it's going to be kind of frustrating to the reader. So it is easy, not easy, but it is possible to overdo your cost. When you're looking for a cost, you want to come up with something innovative, something that creates those points of conflict, but also something that you can use over time. And it really depends on the magic system that you're creating, how much you want that to be able to use over time. I tend to like magic that can be everyday magic. Meaning every day you could actually use this stuff for some mundane tasks every day if you wanted to. And so therefore I tend to make my costs things that, that over time, you know, they can create struggles for you, they can create things that, that make the hardships for the characters, but really over time, you're not gonna end the world by using the magic every day. And Wheel of Time is actually like this too. Even with the madness, Rand uses the magic every day and takes one step closer to madness. But it's not like you use the magic twice and you go insane. It's like you use the magic 700 times and you go insane, but you can't resist doing it every day, so that only takes 2 years or whatever. You know what I mean? And so look for something that fits your story. You may want to have a story where you have a fantastically, you've got a sliding scale of costs. Your character, you've got sort of there was a superheroes like this. You have a finite amount of power, and when it runs out, you can no longer do things. And making certain effects happen takes away some of this innate magic. And so you can cast some big, massive, powerful spell that leaves you without any power, or takes half of your magic, or you can cast little spells. What's that?
A genie with 3 wishes.
Yeah, a genie with 3 wishes. You could do something like that, but it would be more like a genie with scaling wishes. If you make little wishes, you get 100. If you wish for something really, really, costly, then you only get 2. And so you got to decide. And forcing your character to make those decisions can be really interesting, and that gives you a sliding scale. You may want to decide to do something like that, but whatever you do, be thinking about the costs. Weaknesses. Weaknesses are really kind of the hardest one, because weaknesses are easy to make into just cliches. Kryptonite is a great example. This is when you build into your magic system an irrational weakness. Kryptonite is not a rational weakness. It works really well, but it's not. You don't see the magic and think, he can fly. Well, obviously this rock is going to make his power go away. There's no rational connection between those. It's just the law of the magic system. There's nothing wrong with that. I like to write rule-based magic systems, but rule-based does not mean make sense. It means consistent. Being consistent is more important than making sense, because we're writing magic, and you can outline the rules at the beginning, and they can be set however you want, and they don't have to make rational sense as long as you stick to them. But it's very easy to work a kryptonite in that readers are like, that's just a kryptonite. And nowadays, during the Golden Age, Superman has kind of survived because of, really, I would say it's more the moral code thing that makes him awesome. Kryptonite is kind of a holdover to a previous era. You don't see a lot of superheroes nowadays, even superhero films from characters from those days, that deal with this type of weakness. They tend to try to make the conflicts more internal to the character, like, Batman, the new Batman. The new Batman means Batman started in the 80s. The Batman who his weakness is his dark, brooding inner demons, not magic rock makes me lose powers. But you can still make magic rock makes me lose powers if you build it in right. Basically, this is a way to negate how the magic works. It is a way to negate the main character's powers or the practitioner's powers by using something in the setting and world. And if this is done right, it can still make great points of conflict. It can still tell a great story. This is the cross to a vampire is a weakness. But you can build into your magic system cool weaknesses that would make it stop working. I've read about, magic systems that one of the weaknesses that you've got this whole technology versus magic sort of thing, and if somebody learns too much about the technology, then the magic slowly stops working for them. And so that's actually kind of interesting. I don't know if it says good things about, be dumb or the magic won't work, which I don't know, but it is kind of an interesting weakness that faced by logic and thought. It's the bugs, or the roadrunner runs off the cliff and doesn't know about gravity, so he keeps going, sort of magic system. That I would actually put under a weakness of the magic that you can negate the magic by teaching them. But you can work in interesting weaknesses. If you know what you're doing, just be careful not on these to make it sound like it's kryptonite, that it's magic rock, no more powers.
Is there something like that in the Wheel of Time?
I don't really see something like that. I mean, you could call, Calendar has a weakness. That's one of them. I mean, Calendar is a subset of the magic system. You see some weaknesses, what's that? Fork root, there you go. That's right, fork root. And fork root does work really well. Because, it's actually something the book's really needed with Jim added, which is a way to let non-channelers control a channeler without having to have a caller.
You also have steadying and formatting guardians.
What's that? Oh yeah, guardians and Matt's medallion could be considered a weakness. It's not really a limitation on the magic. The magic is not like, and there's this subset that doesn't work for it. That's not really how I think of limitations. That's a weakness that there are things built in. So there are these. They don't become the major story conflicts. They become smaller conflicts for creating smaller plot cycles, and they work well in their realm, but they don't rise to the level that that some of these other ones do. But that's okay. Makes sense to everybody? You guys have questions? Fire some questions at me if you have any, or we will move on to something different. You're good with that? Okay. So, you guys want to talk about outlining? Have I talked about this yet? One of these that you remember?
Yeah, you talked a little bit in the first year.
First year I did outlining.
Yeah.
Okay.
Outliners versus the...
Okay, I did talk about outliners versus... I have a better term for that now, because George R. Martin used the term gardener and architect, which you may have seen me starting to use. For a refresher course, writers tend to fall into two categories. And there's a continuum between them, but you either tend to be more of an architect, which means you like to plan your book out ahead of time and know exactly where it's going, or you tend to be more of a gardener, which is you start with an interesting concept and then you grow it and see where it goes. And so I'm more of an architect. Robert Jordan is more of a gardener. Let me ask you guys this then. What questions did you come having? What are the biggest troubles for you as writers? Let's do, we've got 30 minutes left. If there are things that you want to hear, ask me about them. I probably have a lecture about it.
Actually, as an architect, I tend to start writing, and I start detailing my world, and I start coming up with, okay, well, I've got this idea, this, and this setting.
Yeah.
How do you go from that to, okay, I need a cool story? I mean,
Right,
I might have a steampunk setting.
Right.
And I've got these
Architects,
ideas.
one of the classic problems with architects is what we call world builder's disease, where you start thinking about cool things and you stop. You can't stop thinking about cool things, so you spend 2 years designing a wonderful world, but at the end of those 2 years you still don't have a story. Because you've got so interested in planning it. This can actually happen to either group. But with architects, you're putting too much in. You're throwing everything in the kitchen sink in. I would say, and this is a problem. This is actually a fairly big problem we see with architects. Usually with gardeners, the problem that we're seeing is that the gardener gets 3 chapters in and then comes up with a cool idea and goes back and rewrites the 3 chapters to fit that cool idea, but really just kind of writes 3 new chapters to a new book, and then gets there and has another cool idea, and then they do this eternally, and you have 15 false starts to your book, Because when you get in, you're like, oh, now I know what this book is about, and then you start over. That's very much a Gardner thing. Or to go back and revise the first chapter every day to make sure that it's just perfect. Those gardeners will never leave their writing alone. But architects have trouble getting started and have trouble revising. Those are our two big problems. If you're having trouble getting started, one suggestion I have you, I keep wanting to sit on this. Do you think this will take me?
Where the lights open.
Yeah, so this
We'll
was.
try not to laugh.
Yeah, try not to laugh. That didn't work. Well, if I scream, ow, I can't finish the last book now, then you won't laugh.
That was me.
We'll hire good kind instead. All right.
It will be all our fault.
Yeah, it'll be all your fault. You hadn't laughed. So, one thing to keep in mind as you're planning your stories is be aware of world builder's disease. Just be aware of it, and be aware that the more you world build, the more tempted you will be to put all of this in the book, and the more distracting it's probably going to be. I write epic fantasy. I assume you're here because you like epic fantasy, so you are at least interested in the concepts of epic fantasy. A lot of you probably want to write it. Epic fantasy, the biggest challenge we have is our learning curve. Every book has a learning curve. Every book, when you start reading it, there are new things you need to learn. For some books, the learning curve is very shallow. You only need to learn a few new names. It's taking place in a familiar place for you. And so the story, you can hit it running. All science fiction fantasy is going to have a steeper learning curve because of the new concepts you're introducing. Epic fantasy has the steepest learning curve of probably any genre because the laws of physics are changing, because there are probably a ton of countries and nationalities and ethnicities. And so the real challenge to starting an epic fantasy is not losing your reader early on because of all of that. And so one of the grand skills to learn as an epic fantasy writer is how to avoid infodumps yet still get information across. And the reason I bring this up to you because the more time you spend world building, the more of a temptation it's going to be for you to front load all that information in your book. And so, what were you going to say?
And I was going to say, it's very hard, you have these concepts, I find it very hard not to go, oh, okay, in this world they have brassinium and da-da-da-da, and then I find myself writing a two-page technical detail on it.
Yep, no, that's a very architect thing. I say this thing is a warning to you just because I want you to be aware of it. But the real answer to how to help you is this co-conflicts thing. It's hard to tell you what to do and not to do because Tolkien spent 20 years designing his world and then wrote these fantastic books. I want to make a living as a writer to support my addiction of writing more books. And to do that, I can't spend 20 years on one, basically. I have to write a lot of books where I don't have 20 years. And so the way to do this is to look for the conflict and world build appropriately. For instance, as you world build, you should be finding conflict points in your world building. Whether you're world building, that you come up with this rare resource, and it's going to be tied to the magic and the politics. You're like, okay, circle that. That's a very big potential conflict point. You're world building, religions, and there's a clash between two of the religious mindsets. You're like, okay, big point of conflict here. Be highlighting those points of conflicts and make your your world building more sparse. Don't write the two-page discourses. Write a couple lines that say, this is what this is going to be. And then move on and do a very broad world building, telling yourself, I will finish a lot of these things later. But first, you need to get your broad world building down and be looking for the points of conflict because those points of conflict are where your story is going to come from. The second thing to do is when you have one of those points of conflict appear, you want to try and think of a way that you can put a character into the middle of that conflict. One of the big dangers for writers is the character at the side of the conflict. If the Wheel of Time were about somebody from the outside watching Rand go crazy, it would be less interesting than being in Rand's head as he goes crazy. And so we have a lot of temptation. New writers tend to want, for some reason, and I don't know why we do this, but we tend to sometimes want to put the character on the outside observing. It's, even the stranger rides into town can be the outsider observing. It can be a really dangerous thing because it can create plots that are not engaging to the reader because they're not in the center of the conflict. So, what you want to do is when you find one of these points of friction where something's rubbing, where this social policy is rubbing against this social policy, or where this resource is limited, or with this cool limitation on the magic, it would be really interesting to be in someone's head there. And then build that character into your plot as a potential main character. And be looking for this, and as an architect, we usually try to do this isn't going to work for everybody, but be looking for and having 24 of those in your notes as potential characters, and start to look for interaction between those characters that would create more conflict, and try to build someone who's kind of at the conflux of all of this. If you reverse engineer the Wheel of Time, Rand at the conflicts of the magic, but also being opposed to his childhood friend, because there's going to be an opposition there with the White Tower and with the Dragon Reborn, looking for all these different sources of conflict, and piling on. And when you've got a character that you're really interested in, that is really at the center of all these things, then go back to all those different lines that are drawn to that character and world build those. The ones that don't have a main character at the center of them, don't world build yet. Now, you as an architect are going to love world building all through the process. What this will allow you to do is allow you to start writing about these characters, and new ideas will be sparked and all of these things. And at that point, I would suggest that you make goals. Daily writing goals or weekly writing goals. And you tell yourself, I'm allowed to world build as much as I want as long as I hit my word length goal. I have to write this much new prose, and then I can spend this much time world building. And you will probably find that is far more useful to you as a writer over the long term, because you're going to need practice to become a better writer, and this is going to help you do it, but you're also going to find that your world building is more meaningful when, instead of world building and spending 2 pages, because we want to do it as architects, 2 pages about this hill where a battle was fought years ago, and having a fascinating battle that happened there, that's not going to be as useful to you as this battle that this old grizzled warrior fought in, who's a main character, if that makes sense. Him remembering the blood, the bloodsoe, Ituralde remembering that famous battle is much more interesting than Rand and mooring past, fallen statue, and she says, oh, this was such and such. That can still be interesting, but this one is more interesting. And if you spend more of your time on these than on these, you can fill in these as you go, and you won't be as tempted to load us up with a bunch of them. All right? So that's my advice. Dr. Brandon's writing advice to your specific individual issue with writing, because I went through some of that. All right, other questions?
If you absolutely had to do expository writing, have a brilliant device like Roydion, or whatever you call it.
Where you put the character in the shoes. Roydion worked wonderfully.
Brilliant.
For that. You wouldn't want to start a book with Roydion, though. This is the thing we got to understand about the learning curve, is when you're doing a learning curve, you want to try and do stuff to mitigate that, because a lot of fantasy, it's like this. This is your learning curve. This is Stephen Erickson. You start your book and then, wow! And it depends on the type of book you're wanting to write. There's a lot of brilliance to what he was doing. Way of Kings has a very steep learning curve. I was able to give myself a steeper learning curve because I felt that readers would trust me enough that it would pay off. And one of the reasons that the learning curve is troubling is because, number one, new readers who aren't familiar with your work or with the, is familiar with the genre may pick this up and be like, wow, I can't follow anything that's going on, put it down. But there's also a danger in established readers. How many of you said, wow, I'm not going to get into another one of these big series because I got bit before, I'm going to wait until they're done, or whatnot, right? Yeah. But when you pick up a book like this and start reading, you say, wow, I don't know if this is going to be worth the effort. I know it's going to be a lot of work to get there, and if the payoff isn't awesome at the end of the story, I've just spent so much effort to read this big epic fantasy that it's going to be frustrating. And as an established writer, I hope that people who have read my books before say, well, I know Brandon can do the payoff, so I'll put the investment in that's, of the aggravation up front. But particularly as a new writer, you want to be doing everything you can, would be my suggestion, to mitigate your learning curve at the beginning. You can give yourself the, you can let yourself get away with things the more writing you do, but the first few books, try and mitigate that learning curve. And so this is why I say don't do Rodion in your first chapter. Usually, your prologue can get away with anything. Prologues are okay. But first chapter's job should be to introduce a sympathetic or interesting character, or both, and put them in a situation that's fairly relatable, and introduce conflict right off the bat. This is why epic fantasy and books and stories in general tend to start with something like the farm setting. It's sympathetic character in a relatable situation. It's become something of a cliche by these days. So I would warn you to watch out for it, because now a lot of readers pick up and say, first chapter, oh, another farm boy saves the world. I've read this a bunch of times. It was done really well by a bunch of authors I love. This person's not going to be able to cut it. But you can still put people in an interesting, sympathetic situation without having to do that. The reason why that works, why so many authors did it during the 80s and 90s, was because you could introduce a character first in a familiar situation, and then you could learning curve us slowly along. Wheel of Time has a very nice learning curve for an epic fantasy. You'll notice, the first book, he doesn't start having adding viewpoint characters till over halfway through the book. It's all ran up until Shadow Logo, and then we split and start having Nynaeve and Perrin as viewpoint characters. But up until then, one character to keep track of viewpoint-wise, one relatable plot. We have to stay away from these things that are going to kill us, and slowly build onto the larger, you're going to go mad, all of this stuff, step by step. That's something that I would highly recommend to writers at the start. Now, that doesn't mean that you want chapters 1 through 5 to all take place in the same boring place, right? You want to get into the conflict pretty early. Notice that Rand sees the Myrddraal in chapter 1, like on page 2. And we start the conflict from there. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to spend ages here, but you can start us in a relatable place and then move on. But if you do have to do expository, which we all have to do, doing something like Rodion is great. Finding ways that you can actually show us the information rather than giving us a long discourse on it is always a good idea. And if you want to know more about that, we talked last year a lot about show versus tell. And Steve recorded that whole thing and put it on YouTube. And so it actually turned out to be a pretty good couple of lectures. Because off the cuff, all of these things, I have points that I want to talk about, but they're all different every time I go. So go watch those. Those worked out pretty well. All right, other questions? Oh, come on. You've got me. You don't have any questions? Nothing bothers you? Okay, we'll go here and then there.
Can you talk a little bit about how you develop your antagonists?
How I don't mind antagonists. That's going to go into characterization, which really, honestly, the lecture last year on characterization was really good, so you watch that. But antagonists, you're going to have to decide where they're going to fall on the sympathy scale. Whether they're going to be the antagonists that you read their viewpoint and you understand their viewpoint, and you grow to like them even as you see them doing horrible things. Or or if they're going to be the more faceless evil, or if they're going to be just ruthless dictator. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, the villain, the big choice to make is where they are on the sympathy scale. The idea back here, where it is limitations more important than powers, villains fall into that whole idea of limitations more important than powers. In fact, if you really think about it, like I said, and I actually forgot to get into this, the limitations versus power thing is more than just a magic system concept. What your characters aren't capable of, their flaws, are generally going to be more interesting than what they are capable of. Where your characters are having trouble, plot-wise, is going to be more interesting than what they breeze through. And so it's a wider storytelling thing. And your villain is, in a lot of ways, a limitation. It's something that the heroes are going to have to face. Their place in the plot is to be a hindrance. And so because of that, really great villains tend to make a really great story. Keeping that in mind, and we have this trouble in storytelling sometimes that the villains become more interesting than the heroes. It's happened, you know, it happened for years in Batman. You know, that's something to be aware of. But I do think that really strong villains make for really capable heroes. If you have a weak villain, you're going to have a weak hero. And so because of that, or not have a weak hero, the hero doesn't have to struggle that much to overcome them. So building your villain, remember, think of them as a limitation and try to make them fascinating and connected, you know, to that whole points of conflict issue. But decide if it's really going to be a villain or an antagonist. There are some times where you just have an antagonist that, you know, fate has placed in the way of the protagonist. But that's the real decision to make. And then watch that other lecture and decide where you want them on the sympathy scale and make them interesting as a limiting factor. All right?
I was going to say I fall under the architect stereotype a little bit. And so when I've got a plot line set up for a specific chapter and I'm trying to govern the dialogue to a certain area, I'm having trouble trying to force myself to not steer it to the point where you see the hand of God coming into the dialogue. And,
right. You're writing stilted dialogue, in other words. That's something that's actually pretty hard to learn how to achieve. But I just read your shirt. It's a grammar shirt. It's cool. So dialogue, as an architect, not letting the hand of God be seen. Your best fix for this is to be goal-based, perhaps. When I talk about plotting for architects, the best way to plot I've found for architects is goal-based. Meaning you're going to know where you're going to end up, usually as an architect. And so I tend to work backward in my outlines. I start with my ending in mind, and then I say, okay, what do I have to do to achieve this? What are interesting ways to achieve this? What are different things that the characters can try and fail at? Because, you know, I want to try good things and I'm failing. Anyway, build all of these conflicts by working backward is what I do. And then I write the book forward. And if you go into a scene goal-based by saying, all right, identify what it is you want to achieve as the hand of God. All right? And write that down. Goal for this scene is this plot point must be revealed. But then say, okay, but what are the goals of each of the characters in this conversation? And actually sit down and say, okay, character 1, character 2, character 3. What are their driving motivations and passions? What are they going to be interested in? And your goal is, therefore, to find an interesting way to achieve your goal through what the characters want to achieve. And try to think about those interactions, if that makes any sense at all. You know, a great example. Let's see if we can come up with an example. Not a great example. Let's see if we can do something. So you as a writer have a goal that that these two characters need to decide to work together on an issue. And you don't want it to come off as stilted, but it's going to be very hard because when you sit down, you say, okay, character 1 wants this goal over here, character 2 wants this goal over here, there's no reason why they should work together. And yet you as the hand of God reach in and say, by end of conversation, you've both decided to work together. And if you identify that problem ahead of time, looking, saying, wow, that's what my issue is going to be, you can build, you're an architect, you'll come up with a way, you just got to come up with what is the common ground going to be? Why are they going to work together? What's going to force them to work together? And you'll actually have to create that. It can be an external force, it can be a common ground, but figure it out ahead of time, how you're going to do it by maintaining, what was that?
You can make them fall in love.
You can make them fall in love. But figure it out ahead of time. So that, and then when you say, okay, find a good way for it to come out, and then you can write the scene with the character's motivations and passions, directing the scene, not you, because you already know how this one piece is going to happen. I think it's very important to learn how to write from a character's viewpoint and motivations for these reasons. Does that help? Does that make sense?
It helps, but
yeah,
writing from a character's point of view is still something I'm working on.
Yeah, and I did viewpoint last year, did I not? I did a very good viewpoint thing last year. So you may, if you haven't seen that one, you may want to watch it. But basically, the idea is you really do, particularly in epic fantasy with a lot of different characters, getting into somebody's head and seeing how they see the world differently is a really great skill to master as an aspiring epic fantasy writer. And one way to do it is to hold a brainstorming session with your friends where you brainstorm, and we did this last year, brainstorm a couple of characters off the cuff that are really not based in any story you have, and then try and write a scene of them riding through town. And then write another scene from another character. You know, brainstorm like 5 very different characters and try to write a scene where they all see different things and feel different things and look for different things riding through the same town. And train yourself that way to see the world in 5 different ways. You know, the shepherd's daughter riding through the city is different than the merchant riding through the city, is different from the, the mortician's daughter who secretly wants to be an actress in with a traveling troupe. You know, she's going to see very different things, and you know, work into each of them what their main motivations and the main things they want in life, and have them just ride through town. If you can start practicing how to do this, sorry, that's all right. I can answer it if you want. Hi, this is Brandon. I've done that before, but only like when someone's waiting in line for a signing, and I say, "Ooh, do they know who I am?" They're like, "Yeah, they're probably calling to ask me to get my book signed a certain way." And then I answer, and it's fun. do some viewpoint exercises. That will help you a lot.
Thank you.
So one of the things I struggle with is it's part of world building, I guess, or story building or plotting, but differentiating between what are the common tropes that maybe are almost necessary for the readers of epic fantasy to identify with this as an epic fantasy, and what are things that are just cliche that are on the board?
Yeah, you're looking at this is actually a good question, a good thing for people to understand. So, I'm going to switch to green. So, writing in any genre, storytelling in any of its many varied ways, really comes down to a kind of balance between familiar and strange. And each different genre is going to have its own feeling of balance here. Some genres, you know, that line, if it's like here, is like right there. Meaning, most people reading that really want the familiar and not the strange. The classic romance novel is basically this. The reader's looking for a certain experience, and that experience can't deviate too much from the experience they've had before. Otherwise, yeah, it's not going to be successful. Your average film critic wants to be over here. Okay? They've seen it all, and they're a critic. They're literary. They want to be impressed with something new, and so they're really looking for that. Of course, done in a good way. It's not you can't just throw eggs at the screen for 2 hours because nobody's done it and have it. Unless you're Andy Kaufman. But where is that balance, and where do you want to be on that balance? And it's really actually a tough thing to decide. Because for a while, I kind of feel that people in fantasy wanted this. This is in the early days of fantasy. People had read Tolkien, and everyone's like, wow, this is fantastic. What is this? I've never read this before, epic fantasy in particular. And I want something more like this. And the very successful projects during that era were things like Terry Brooks. Where Terry Brooks really is pretty far over here. If you've read Tolkien, Sword of Shannara becomes a very familiar story. The question is, was that really where genre readers want to be? Or is that where we were because everyone is still trying to figure out what Tolkien had done? And we didn't have our feet underneath us yet. Because you'll notice, I've noticed at least, that the longer epic fantasy has been around, the more this direction it's gone for the successful books. And we're really kind of in the middle right now on that. I think if you look at the things that are being really successful, George R. R. Martin, Pat Rothfuss, Jim Butcher, we're not all the way over here, or even here. We are kind of right here. And it seems like epic fantasy readers, reading books, we want to have the same emotions and feelings inspired in of the great books we've read in the past, but we want it done in different ways. We want different characters and things, and you'll notice that a lot of these books, well, you may not notice, but I noticed, a lot of these books in the late 90s and early 2000s did not do very well. And my armchair feel on this is that our readership was, we had the boom for fantasy. The first big boom was in the 80s. This is when Donaldson and Eddings were hitting the bestseller list, and it was the first time that fantasy writers were really hitting the bestsellers list. Tolkien accepted, because Tolkien was really the Harry Potter of his day. No one knew what to make of this thing that just came out of nowhere. In the 80s, a large influx of readers, and by the late 90s, these large influx of readers had now read the same story enough times that they're saying, okay, I'm done with the familiar, give me some strange. And I think that's why it shifted, and I think the marketing, the publishers were slow on the uptake to catch on when this was happening. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, books with elves and dwarfs, unless they were tie-ins, so D&D tie-in things, were flopping right and left. And I think that's because of this shift. So the question is, you're trying to decide where things fall. You may have this great idea and you're worried that it's actually all the way over here when you think it's like over here. And the best ways I've found to deal with this are, number one, great limitations. Because you can take something here and move it all the way over here with a great limitation. And that happens with characters, plot elements. If your conflict is interesting, when you boil it down, the plots are all basically, there's not that many plots. But when you put interesting limitations and quirks on them, they become more fascinating. And so really, the genesis idea is not so much to worry about, it's the depth of that idea. How deep you pull it, and whether you're capable of adding in all these connections to world and connections to character and making it deeply limited in ways that are fascinating, whatever the idea is, that's where you're going to pull it over to the strange. And you can do this with anything. There are some cliched character tropes in fantasy, and I suggest moving away from them. But the way you move away from them is not to try saying, well, I've seen too many grizzled old wizards, and so now I am going to create, a grizzled old talking horse that'll be you can go too far. But saying, for instance, okay, I've seen too many people fill this role in the plot the same way. What can I do to make this one different? What can I do to say this character is going to fill this role in the plot, but they are not equipped for that role in the plot? Instead of the grizzled old wizard, we're going to dump the memory and knowledge of a 300-year-old person into the mind of a 12-year-old girl, and she has to be Gandalf. Right? Suddenly you've got someone different filling the role. Her role in this book is Gandalf's role, but she's a 12-year-old girl. Why would that work? How would that be interesting? Does that make sense? And so the goal is to take things and just try and move them this way. But do remember, people who are reading epic fantasy, when I read epic fantasy, I want to capture the feelings I had when I've read great ones. And what does that for me? I've tried to identify it. It's going to be different for you. You're going to have to identify what the things you love about it are. And write the things you love. Don't worry if it's going to sell or not. Write the things you love and then find a way to sell it. But for me, what are those feelings? It's a deep connection to character. It's a fascinating world they live in. And it is the connection between the two. That's what makes epic fantasy for me. Immersion into interesting characters and a different world. And so identify what those things are to you and try to use that to move yourself wherever you want to be on this line. If it is the interaction between elves and dwarves that really fascinates you, don't not write that just because I say they don't sell. Because you can never tell what will and won't sell. I was at World Fantasy Convention in 2001, and someone said vampire novels never sell. Someone really said that, said there won't be any big vampire books for a while. So yeah, that was pretty wrong. So don't, 10 minutes? Okay. Are you giving me extra time because I was late?
No, we also have extra time because there's an hour in the next room.
Okay, but I have something at like sometime.
Shouldn't be till 4.
What?
It shouldn't be till 2:30.
2:30. I do have something. I don't have anything till 2:30. What time is it?
1:30.
1:30. Okay. So I'll go a few more minutes, and then I will go get some food, and then I can go to my cafe clutch, which for me is an ice water clutch. All right. Does that help? I think that's really what you want to do. You first got to decide where you want to be on here, and move them that way by. Oh hey, hi. She just told me I have a few minutes left.
I missed my shot.
To your face.
Well, it's just because I was late.
You were, yeah.
You were late? That's crazy.
Oh, imagine that. First panel in the morning, and I was on time for me.
Of course they did. You requested to be not the first panel in the morning, so you were the second panel in the morning. You're still late.
Hey. If you're going to schedule me for magic until 5 a.m., which totally did. Yeah, it was right there. I saw it. It was on my schedule, Aubrey.
Till 5?
Till 5 a.m. And I just had to be there.
Give me your placard, Brandon.
I just had to be. What, my placard? I don't see a placard. What?
Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah. Magic, 8:30 until 5 a.m.
No, magic.
It's right there. I can see it.
I sliced your face. I can't believe anything this man says. See,
It's magic lettering.
You're done at 1:30.
I'm at 1:30.
So you're
What? Let me see.
10 minutes.
I'm 10 minutes over already. Okay, I'm going to answer one more question. All right, one more question, right here.
Okay, I've created a jolly world where women are in charge, and now I have to write the expansionist, male-dominated empire across the mountains that wants to conquer them, and I'm stuck. Do you have a suggestion? I mean, just about being stuck.
Ninjas? No, this is a good question. First off, do you know if you're a discovery writer or if you're a gardener or an architect?
I'm a gardener.
You're a gardener. Okay. Then this will work well for you then. Basically, you're stuck, but you really just need to write anyway. And so the thing to do, you're as a gardener, you know that you're going to prune things anyway. You're going to change things. I suggest taking it 2 different courses, sitting down and deciding what are 2 completely different ways this could go, and knowing that you're not really probably going to take either of them, and just start writing it, and just see where it goes. Does that make sense? You want to, you want to, and really honestly, look for things that are kind of bizarre, that you would never really want in the final book. The idea is to jog yourself and and get yourself writing so that you don't stop. Because if you stop, is it Tony?
Yes.
Yeah. If you stop, Tony, your instinct is going to be to go back and start over again, revise something. You're gonna get stuck in a revision probably, and so you want to keep that forward momentum. And so even if it is grabbing 3 people you trust, sitting them down, and saying, okay, here's the situation. Throw weird ideas at me for what could happen. You want them to be in world. You don't actually want them to be ninjas attack. But you want that outsider's perspective, and they're going to say something. You're like, no, that's just totally not my story. But then write it anyway for a few chapters. Add a new character, whatever it takes. Your mind has to be writing to work through this problem, most likely. And so you'll figure out what you want to do by writing what you're going to throw away. And that's very hard for new writers, to write stuff you're going to throw away. And this works for both groups, but it's particularly useful for discovery writers, I find, to just force yourself to write something that you're not anticipating, you're not expecting, and keep yourself going.
Yeah, I've done that before. I threw away the first 7 chapters of my first novel, which is a real-world setting.
Okay. Yeah. You're just going to have to, architects usually say having a brainstorming session and thinking about it for a while will work, but that doesn't work for most discovery writers I know. They need to be writing to think. And so you need to be writing to think, and you're not going to find your solution to that problem until you've been going for a little while. All right? All right, that's it for me, folks. Thank you to Matt Hatch for listening to the last 3 minutes.
It was great.
Yeah.
Inspiring.
Yeah.